In the fluorescent-lit community center of Pine Ridge, Idaho, a sense of indifference permeated the air. The small, one-eyed pitbull mix cowered in the corner of his makeshift pen, his patchy fur and protruding ribs telling a story of neglect and abandonment. The dog trembled uncontrollably, pressing himself against the metal fencing as if trying to disappear from the judgmental gazes of potential buyers milling around the local animal auction. His remaining eye, cloudy and dull, darted nervously across the room, never making contact with the humans who paused briefly at his enclosure before quickly moving on to more appealing options. "That one's from the Johnson property," a heavy-set man in overalls explained to the crowd. "Found him chained up after they skipped town, half-starved and meaner than a rattlesnake. County says he's got to go somewhere today, or it's the needle." Murmurs rippled through the small gathering. "Pitbull with one eye? Who'd want that liability?" Someone scoffed. "Probably been used for fighting," another voice added with a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. The auctioneer, a lanky man, with thinning hair and spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, cleared his throat and adjusted his microphone. The squeal of feedback momentarily silenced the crowd as he gestured toward the trembling dog. Next up, lot number 17. Male pitbull mix, approximately 3 years old, according to the vet. As you can see, he's got some challenges. The auctioneer's forced chuckle echoed uncomfortably through the room. "Starting bid at $20. Anyone? Folks, the county shelter is at capacity, and this is his last chance. $20. The silence that followed was heavy with collective apathy. The dog seemed to understand what was happening, his body sinking lower to the ground as if accepting his fate. The auctioneer sighed, clearly eager to move on. "All right then, no takers at 20. How about $10? Surely someone needs a guard dog or something." A few people shuffled their feet. Someone coughed. The auctioneer's shoulders slumped slightly as he prepared to declare the dog unsold. "Going once for $10, I'll take him for $50. The high-pitched voice cut through the silence like a bell, causing every head in the community center to turn toward its source. In the back of the room, barely visible above the shoulders of the adults surrounding her, stood a small girl with unruly red curls and a determined expression. She clutched a pink plastic purse in one hand and held up a crumpled fistful of dollar bills in the other. Mild laughter rippled through the crowd as the girl's mother, a tired-looking woman in scrubs, leaned down to whisper urgently in her daughter's ear, "Lily, no. We talked about this. We're just here to look, remember?" But 7-year-old Lily Parker stood her ground, her freckled chin jutting out with determination that belied her years. "He needs me, Mom. Look at him. He's scared, and nobody wants him." Her voice carried across the now silent room. "I've been saving my birthday money and my allowance. I have $57.38. The auctioneer exchanged uncomfortable glances with the county animal control officer standing nearby. The girl's mother straightened up, her face flushed with embarrassment as she placed her hands firmly on her daughter's shoulders. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Lily wriggled free and took 3 determined steps forward. "Please," the little girl said, her voice suddenly soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "They're going to kill him if nobody takes him. I've been reading about rescue dogs, and I know he can get better if someone just gives him a chance." The room fell uncomfortably silent. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, clearly uncertain how to proceed. The pitbull had raised his head, slightly, his one good eye now fixed on the small figure standing apart from the crowd. "Young lady," the animal control officer started, his tone gentler than before. "This isn't a suitable pet for a child. This dog has behavioral issues and needs experienced handling. He's not been properly socialized and—" "I have a piggy bank at home with more money," Lily interrupted, her voice wobbling slightly but her resolve unwavering. "And I've been reading books from the library about dog training. I know about positive reinforcement and patience and building trust." A few adults exchanged glances, torn between amusement and admiration for the child's determination. The dog remained focused on Lily, his trembling momentarily stilled. The girl's mother stepped forward, placing a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Lily, honey, I understand you want to help, but this isn't the right dog for us. Remember, we talked about finding a nice family dog that's good with children, but nobody else wants him, Mom," Lily whispered loudly, tears now welling in her eyes. "They're going to kill him today. Please, I promise I'll do all the work. I'll train him every day. I'll use my allowance for his food. Please, Mom." "Sarah." Parker looked from her daughter's pleading face to the trembling, one-eyed dog and back again. As a pediatric nurse, she'd developed a fairly accurate sense for distinguishing between a child's fleeting obsessions and genuine conviction. What she saw in her daughter's eyes gave her pause. "The dog is dangerous, Mom," the animal control officer said quietly, stepping closer. "We've had him at the shelter for the 2-week holding period. He's shown aggression toward male staff, members and resource guarding with food, with your daughter's safety in mind." "He's not dangerous," Lily insisted, tears now streaming down her freckled cheeks. "He's just scared. Wouldn't you be scared if you only had one eye and nobody wanted? You and everyone was saying mean things about you." A murmur went through the crowd, and Sarah noticed several people looking down, suddenly finding the floor extraordinarily interesting. The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably, seemingly eager to move past this unexpected disruption. "Perhaps we should continue with the next lot," he suggested, avoiding eye contact with the tearful child. "Wait!" The voice came from the back of the room. A man in his 60s with weathered features and a flannel shirt stepped forward. "I've trained hunting dogs all my life, and I've seen plenty of basket cases turn around with the right handling." He looked at Lily with appraising eyes. "Girls got heart, that's for sure, and sometimes that counts for more than experience." Sarah felt her daughter's small hand slip into hers and squeeze tightly. She looked down into Lily's hopeful face, then at the pitiful creature in the pen who still hadn't taken his eye off her daughter. "If I may," another voice interjected. A woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a practical bun stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Rivera, the veterinarian who examined this dog when he was brought in. While I can't dismiss the behavioral concerns Officer Jenkins mentioned, I should note that this dog has shown no aggression toward women or children. His issues appear to be specifically with adult males in authoritative positions, which suggests targeted abuse rather than generalized aggression." Sarah hesitated, trying to think rationally despite the emotional weight of the moment. As a single mother working long shifts at Valley General Hospital, adding a troubled rescue dog to their already complicated lives seemed like madness. Yet something about the connection already forming between her daughter and this broken animal gave her pause. $57.38, Lily repeated, reaching up to wipe tears from her cheeks with her sleeve. The auctioneer looked toward the animal control officer, who shrugged slightly, his expression suggesting that he'd washed his hands of the situation. The county had done its due diligence. What happened next wasn't his responsibility. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, bringing down his gavel with a crack that made the pitbull flinch. "Lot 17 to the young lady in the back. Please see Mrs. Wilson at the registration desk to complete the paperwork." A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room. Someone in the back clapped briefly before stopping, apparently realizing the inappropriateness of applause in this context. Lily's face transformed instantly from tearful pleading to radiant joy as she turned to her. "Mother, thank you, thank you, thank you," she whispered, wrapping her arms around Sarah's waist. Sarah Parker stood frozen, wondering what madness had possessed her to allow this purchase. As a medical professional, she prided herself on making rational, evidence-based decisions. There was nothing rational about bringing a one-eyed, traumatized pit bull with known behavioral issues into a home with a 7-year-old child. As the crowd dispersed, their attention turning to the next animal up for auction, Lily approached the pen cautiously. The dog pressed himself further into the corner, his body language communicating fear rather than aggression. "Hi," Lily said softly, crouching down several feet away from the pen. "My name is Lily. You're coming home with us now, and nobody's going to hurt you ever again." The pit bull's ear twitched slightly, his one good eye fixed on the small human addressing him with such unexpected gentleness. For a brief moment, something flickered in that cloudy eye, perhaps the faintest glimmer of hope or simply a reflection of the fluorescent lights above. Dr. Rivera approached Sarah, her expression a mixture of concern and cautious optimism. "I can provide some resources for working with traumatized dogs," she offered. "And I'd be happy to make a house call in a few days to check on his adjustment." Sarah nodded numbly, watching her daughter talking softly to the cowering dog. "What have I just agreed to?" she whispered. The veterinarian followed her gaze and smiled slightly. Something either incredibly foolish or remarkably brave. Only time will tell which. As Officer Jenkins approached with a worn leather leash and a stack of liability waiver forms, Lily remained crouched by the pen, talking in soothing tones to her new companion. The dog hadn't moved from his corner, but his eye remained fixed on the little girl, as if she were the only point of light in a world of shadows. No one in the Pine Ridge Community Center that Saturday morning could have predicted what would unfold from this unlikely pairing. Our one-eyed pit bull and a 7-year-old girl would challenge a community's assumptions, heal each other's wounds, and ultimately inspire a movement far beyond their small Idaho town. In that fluorescent-lit room, with a mother signing forms she was already regretting, and a child making promises to a dog who'd never known kindness, everything was about to change. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Lily Parker had always been different from other children her age. While her classmates collected dolls and dreamed of unicorns, Lily filled her shelves with dog training manuals and wildlife encyclopedias. At 7 years old, she could already explain the difference between classical and operant conditioning, concepts that baffled most adults. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Hoffman, had called her preternaturally empathetic during the last parent-teacher conference, a phrase Sarah had to look up later. The child's fascination with animals began shortly after her father's deployment to Afghanistan 3 years earlier, when Captain David Parker's helicopter went down in a remote mountain region, leaving no survivors. 4-year-old Lily had stopped speaking entirely for nearly 6 months. The child psychologist explained it as a trauma response, selective mutism, triggered by overwhelming grief. What eventually coaxed words back from Lily wasn't the carefully structured therapy sessions or the well-meaning relatives with their forced cheerfulness. It was a chance encounter with a therapy dog during a hospital visit when Sarah had brought her daughter to work during a childcare emergency. The golden retriever, trained to provide comfort to pediatric patients, had approached the silent child sitting alone in the break room. Without prompting, the dog had rested his head on Lily's lap and gazed up at her with patient brown eyes. After several minutes of stillness, Lily had whispered her first words in months. "He understands." By the end of that day, Lily had spoken, more to the dog than she had to any human in half a year. Since then, animals, especially dogs, had become Lily's primary focus. She read about them, drew pictures of them, and begged her mother constantly to adopt one. Sarah had always deflected these requests with practical concerns. Their small rental house had barely enough room for the two of them. Her irregular shifts at the hospital meant inconsistent care for a pet. They couldn't afford the veterinary bills on her single income. But the truth that Sarah rarely acknowledged even to herself was simpler and more painful. She was afraid. Afraid of bringing another living being into their fractured family only to potentially lose it. Afraid of watching her daughter form an attachment that might someday be severed. Afraid of the responsibility for another soul's well-being when she barely felt capable of protecting her own child in a world that had already taken so much from them. All these thoughts tumbled through Sarah's mind as she drove home from the auction, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the back seat, separated by a wire barrier hastily installed by Officer Jenkins, the one-eyed pitbull huddled in the far corner of their old Honda Civic, trembling visibly each time they passed over a bump in the road. "I think I'll call him Patch," Lily announced from the passenger seat, twisting around to peer at the frightened animal. "Like a pirate's eye patch. Do you think he'll like that name, Mom?" Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at the dog, who seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible against the upholstery. "Honey, I think we need to have a serious talk about expectations. This dog—" "Patch," Lily corrected firmly. "Patch," Sarah conceded, "has been through a lot of trauma. He might never be the kind of dog you see in movies or books. He might always be scared or difficult. The animal control officer said he has aggression issues, and Dr. Rivera mentioned resource guarding. Do you remember what that means from your books?" Lily nodded solemnly, her freckled face serious beyond her years. "It means he gets scared someone will take his food away, so he growls or snaps to protect it. But that's because nobody ever made sure he had enough before. We can fix that by feeding him in a safe place and not bothering him while he eats, and showing him the food will always be there." Sarah suppressed a sigh, wondering not for the first time where her daughter had acquired such determined optimism. In a world that had given her so little reason for it, David had been the optimist in their family. Sarah had always been the practical one, the planner, the worrier. After his death, she'd expected those roles to remain fixed. She would be the realist, teaching her daughter to protect herself from disappointment. Instead, Lily had somehow absorbed her father's unwavering belief that broken things could be mended, that the world, for all its cruelty, still contained possibilities for healing. "We're going to take this one day at a time," Sarah said finally. As they turned onto Maple Street, The modest homes with their neat yards, a reminder of the normal, peaceful life she had tried to build for her daughter in this small town. Dr. Rivera's going to come check on him tomorrow, and she'll help us make a plan. Until then, he stays in the laundry room with the baby gate up. You don't approach him, you don't try to touch him, and you certainly don't let him out without me present. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Lily replied, using one of her father's old expressions. The familiar phrase sent a pang through Sarah's chest. Their small blue house at the end of the cul-de-sac looked particularly vulnerable today, Sarah thought, as they pulled into the driveway. The peeling paint on the porch railings, the slightly overgrown lawn, the flower beds she never had time to properly tend, all of it seemed to broadcast single mother working too many hours to function. And now they were adding a potentially dangerous dog to the mix. Getting Patch from the car to the house proved challenging. The dog refused to move, freezing completely when Sarah tried to tug gently on the leash Officer Jenkins had provided. "Don't pull him, Mom," Lily said, her voice dropping to the soft, even tone she'd been using at the auction. "He's scared of new places. We need to give him time to feel safe." Sarah checked her watch. Her shift started in 4 hours, and Mrs. Abernathy from next door would be arriving to watch Lily. There were groceries to unpack, dinner to prepare, Lily's homework to supervise, and now somehow she needed to create a safe space for a traumatized dog who wouldn't even exit the car. "Honey, sometimes we need to—" Sarah began, but stopped when she saw Lily sitting cross-legged on the driveway a few feet from the open car door, her expression tranquil. "It's okay to be scared," the little girl was saying to the cowering animal. "Our house looks different from what you're used to, but there's a soft blanket inside, and food and water, and nobody here will hurt you. You can come out when you're ready." Sarah leaned against the side of the car, suddenly exhausted. The weight of single parenthood, of grief, of constant financial, a worry of trying to raise a child with the ghost of her father hovering between them. It all pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. And now this new responsibility, this damaged creature that her daughter was already investing with all her considerable capacity for love. Minutes ticked by. Sarah thought about the groceries warming in the trunk, about the pile of unfolded laundry on the couch, about the bills waiting to be paid at the kitchen table. Then she looked at her daughter, sitting motionless on the concrete, her small face a study in patient determination. The memory surfaced unbidden. David sitting just like that on the floor of their first apartment, coaxing a terrified kitten out from under the radiator. He'd sat there for nearly 2 hours, talking softly, occasionally sliding a treat closer, never rushing. "Some creatures need to come to you on their own terms," he'd explained when Sarah had grown impatient. "You can't force trust. You can only create the conditions where it might grow." Lily was so much like him sometimes that it hurt to look at her. After what seemed an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, Patch took his first tentative step onto the driveway. His whole body remained tense, ready to retreat at the slightest threat. But something in Lily's quiet presence seemed to draw him forward. Another step followed, then another. "That's it," Lily encouraged softly. "You're doing great, Patch." The dog paused at the transition from driveway to grass, sniffing cautiously at this new territory. His one good eye remained fixed on Lily, as if she were the only constant in a shifting, threatening world. "The grass is safe," Lily assured him. "It's nice to walk on. See?" She patted the lawn beside her. To Sarah's amazement, Patch took another. stepped forward, then froze as Mrs. Abernathy's front door opened across the street. The elderly woman peered curiously in their direction. "Is that a new dog, Sarah?" she called, starting to cross the street for a better look. "I didn't know you were getting a—" "Oh my!" Mrs. Abernathy stopped abruptly as she registered the dog's appearance. The missing eye, the scarred muzzle, the protruding ribs, visible even from a distance. Patch immediately backed up, nearly colliding with the car in his haste to retreat from this new threat. "It's okay, Mrs. Abernathy is our friend," Lily said quickly. But the damage was done. The dog had wedged himself back into the car, trembling violently. "I'm so sorry," the older woman said, genuinely contrite. "I didn't mean to frighten him. Poor thing looks like he's been through the wars." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's okay, Clara. He's new. We're still figuring things out." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes widened slightly as she registered. "The dog's breed. Is that a pitbull? I didn't know you were looking for a dog, especially—" She trailed off, clearly trying to find a polite way to question Sarah's judgment. "It's a long story," Sarah replied wearily. "Lily can fill you in while I'm at work. Speaking of which, I need to get him settled before my shift." The older woman nodded, though concern remained etched in the lines around her eyes. "Of course, dear. I'll be over at the usual time. Do you want me to bring some of Harold's old dog things? I still have his bed and some toys in the garage since, well, you..." "No." Harold, Mrs. Abernathy's ancient chocolate lab, had passed away 6 months earlier. The entire neighborhood had mourned the gentle old dog who had been a fixture on the street for over a decade. "That would be wonderful, Clara. Thank you," Sarah said, momentarily touched by the offer. As their neighbor retreated, Sarah turned back to the problem at hand. The sun was lowering in the sky, and her window of preparation time before work was rapidly shrinking. "Lily, we need to get him inside. I have to leave for my shift soon." Her daughter nodded, but made no move to rush the frightened animal. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of hot dog, a remnant of her lunch that she'd apparently been saving. She placed it on the grass a few feet from the car, then backed up several steps. "It's okay, Patch. Mrs. Abernathy is gone now. Look, I have a treat for you." The dog's nose twitched, catching the scent. His one eye darted between the food and the surrounding area, assessing threats. Slowly, painfully slowly, he emerged again from the car, his body low to the ground. Sarah watched, holding her breath, as Patch cautiously approached the piece of hot dog, snatched it quickly, then retreated a few steps to consume it, his eye never leaving Lily. The little girl smiled and placed another piece slightly closer to the house. Again, the dog approached, took the food, and retreated. "He's doing so good, Mom," Lily whispered excitedly. "See? He's learning we won't hurt him." With painstaking patience, Lily created a trail of hot dog pieces leading to the back door of the house. Patch followed this trail cautiously, stopping frequently to scan for threats, but his hunger eventually overcame his fear. When they finally reached the back door that opened into the laundry room, Sarah felt a surprising sense of accomplishment, as if they'd all somehow passed an important test. Patch hesitated at the threshold, clearly wary of entering the confined space. "We've set up a nice place for you," Lily told him, pointing to the old comforter Sarah had hastily arranged in the corner of the laundry room. A bowl of water and a plate with some leftover chicken from last night's dinner sat nearby, safely behind the baby gate that now separated the laundry room from the kitchen. Patch stood frozen in the doorway, caught between hunger and fear. The Sioux internal struggle played out visibly on his scarred face as he looked from the food to the strange humans watching him. "It's okay," Lily said again, stepping back to give him space. "This is your home now." The word home seemed to hang in the air between them. Sarah, who had been trying to create one despite all odds. Lily, who offered it now so freely to this broken creature. And Patch, who had perhaps never known what the word meant. As the dog finally took a hesitant step into the laundry room, Sarah wondered what exactly they had brought into their carefully balanced lives. A project, a pet, or perhaps something more complicated, a mirror reflecting their own wounded hearts, their own struggle to feel safe in a world that had taken so much from them. The first night was the hardest. Sarah left for her shift at the hospital with knots in her stomach, having given Mrs. Abernathy explicit instructions about the new dog in the laundry room. "Don't try to touch him. Don't let Lily near him without supervision. Keep the baby gate up at all times." The older woman had nodded gravely, though Sarah could see the skepticism in her eyes. Clara Abernathy had been helping with Lily since David's death, stepping in as a surrogate grandmother figure when Sarah needed to work night shifts. Her gentle stability had been a lifeline for both mother and daughter, but Sarah knew this situation was testing even Clara's unflappable demeanor. "He just needs time," Lily had insisted as Sarah gathered her things. "Remember how scared I was of thunderstorms after Dad died, and you said I could sleep with the lights on as long as I needed until the scary feelings went away? Patch just needs his lights on for a while." Sarah had smiled at her daughter's analogy, marveling at the child's capacity to draw these connections. Still, she couldn't silence the voice of anxiety that played in a continuous loop as she drove to Valley General. What if Patch lashed out? What if he hurt Lily? What if he was too broken to save? Her nursing shift unfolded in its usual rhythm of beeping monitors, medication schedules, and the quiet conversations with parents of children too ill to sleep. Around midnight, she texted Mrs. Abernathy for an update. "All quiet," came the response. "Dog hasn't moved from corner. Lily finally asleep after reading 3 chapters of dog training book aloud toward laundry room." Sarah smiled slightly, picturing her determined daughter reading instructional text to a traumatized dog as if it were a bedtime story. The image carried her through the rest of her shift, a talisman against the night's dark moments dealing with children in pain. By the time she arrived home at 7 a.m., exhaustion had settled into her bones like sand weighing down a shoreline. The house was quiet, Mrs. Abernathy having left after Sarah texted that she was on her way. Lily would be asleep for another hour before school. Sarah moved quietly to the kitchen, peering through the baby gate into the laundry room. Patch was still in the furthest corner, but the food plate was empty, and she noticed with surprise that the water level in the bowl had dropped. The dog's eye opened as soon as she appeared, tracking her movements with wary attention. His body tensed visibly, pressing further into the corner. "Good morning," Sarah whispered, careful to avoid eye contact, which she knew could be perceived as threatening. "You ate. That's progress." The dog made no response beyond a slight increase in his trembling. Sarah retreated to the kitchen to make coffee, the familiar ritual soothing her frayed nerves. She had just poured her first cup when a sleepy Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, still in the faded unicorn pajamas she'd long outgrown. "How's Patch?" were her first words, her voice rough with sleep. "He ate his dinner," Sarah reported. And drank some water. That's good news. Lily's face brightened instantly, sleep falling away like a discarded blanket. Can I check on him? Slowly, Sarah cautioned. Remember what we talked about. No sudden movements, no loud noises. And stay behind the gate. Lily nodded solemnly and tiptoed to the laundry room, settling cross-legged on the kitchen floor behind the baby gate. Sarah watched as her daughter deliberately yawned and looked away from the dog, mimicking canine calming signals she'd learned from her books. The child's dedication to proper technique would have been amusing if the stakes hadn't felt so high. "Good morning, Patch," Lily said softly, still not looking directly at the dog. "Did you sleep okay? I read you some chapters last night about how dogs learn. I think you're going to be really smart at training." To Sarah's surprise, Patch's trembling seemed to subside slightly at the sound of Lily's voice. The dog's eye remained fixed on the child, his body language still clearly communicating fear, but something in Lily's presence seemed to calm him. "Dr. Rivera is coming to check on you today," Lily continued in the same gentle tone. "She's really nice. She helps animals feel better." Sarah glanced at the clock. She'd need to get Lily ready for school soon, and her own exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. The thought of dealing with a veterinary visit after a night shift made her want to crawl into bed and pull the covers over her head. "Honey, why don't you get dressed for school while I make your breakfast? We need to keep to our routine." Lily looked reluctant to leave her post at the baby gate, but nodded and headed to her room. Alone again, Sarah faced the dog, who seemed to retreat further into himself without Lily's presence. "She believes in you," Sarah told him quietly. "I hope you prove her right." Dr. Rivera arrived promptly at 9 a.m. after Sarah had walked Lily to the bus stop. The veterinarian carried a large bag of equipment, but moved with a deliberate slowness that suggested long experience with frightened animals. "How was the first night?" she asked, setting her bag down carefully in the kitchen, well away from the laundry room entrance. "He ate and drank a little," Sarah reported. "Hasn't moved much from that corner. No aggression, but he's clearly terrified." Dr. Rivera nodded, unsurprised. "That's to be expected. Mind if I take a look at him?" They approached the baby gate together, the veterinarian hanging back slightly to observe before making her presence fully known. Patch immediately registered the newcomer, his body tensing as he tried to make himself even smaller in the corner. "He's better with Lily," Sarah explained. "Seems less afraid when she talks to him." Children can sometimes connect with traumatized animals in ways adults can't, Dr. Rivera observed. They're less threatening physically, and there's an authenticity to their emotions that animals respond to. Plus, your daughter has a remarkable presence for someone so young. The veterinarian settled on the floor, deliberately making herself smaller. "Hello there," she said to Patch in a low, soothing voice. "Remember me? I was a bit rushed when we met at the shelter. This is a much nicer situation for a proper introduction." Patch's eye darted between Dr. Rivera and Sarah, clearly assessing potential threats. The veterinarian made no move to enter the laundry room, simply sitting quietly and occasionally looking away to reduce the pressure of her gaze. "What I'd like to do today is just observe him," she explained to Sarah. "Any attempt at a physical examination would be counterproductive at this point. Traumatized dogs need time to decompress before we ask anything of them." Sarah nodded, relieved. "What about his medical needs? The eye socket, those scars? Should we be treating them?" From what I could see during his initial exam, the eye was removed some time ago, likely due to an injury. The socket has healed, though not ideally. The other scars are older as well. None represent immediate medical concerns. Dr. Rivera's expression darkened slightly. What he needs most right now is security and consistency. Medicine can wait. For the next hour, the veterinarian observed Patch while sharing her insights with Sarah. She explained how dogs who had experienced severe neglect or abuse often developed specific triggers. Men with deep voices, sudden movements, raised hands, confined spaces. The key was to identify these triggers and work around them until the dog gradually learned new associations. Based on his reactions at the shelter and what we're seeing now, I'd guess he was kept chained, possibly in a small space, and handled roughly by a male owner, Dr. Rivera theorized. The resource guarding suggests food was unpredictable or used as punishment. These aren't wild guesses. The body keeps the score, as they say in trauma work. His reactions tell us his history. Sarah thought of her pediatric patients, how their small bodies sometimes held stories their words couldn't tell. The child who flinched at raised voices, who hoarded food from the cafeteria, who couldn't bear to be touched. The parallels made her chest ache. "What's our plan then?" she asked, her nurse's mind seeking concrete steps, measurable progress. Dr. Rivera smiled slightly. Patience, consistency, safety. He needs to learn that food comes regularly, that people move predictably, that he has choices. No forced interactions, no rushing his adjustment. Let him set the pace. And if he never adjusts, Sarah voiced her deepest fear. If he's always like this, afraid, shut down, potentially dangerous. The veterinarian considered the question. Seriously. Every dog has a threshold, how much they can recover from severe trauma. Some bounce back remarkably, others carry deeper scars. We won't know his capacity for months. But I will say this. What I'm seeing today is a dog who's afraid, not aggressive. Fear can trigger aggression, but they're not the same thing. Dr. Rivera packed up her equipment, having made no attempt to directly interact with Patch. I'd like to come back in a few days. Meanwhile, keep doing what you're doing. Regular meals, quiet environment, no pressure. Document any changes, especially around Lily, and call me immediately if you see any concerning behaviors. After the veterinarian left, Sarah stood in the kitchen, overwhelmed by the responsibility she'd taken on. She hadn't slept in over 24 hours, had another shift that evening, and now had detailed instructions for rehabilitating a traumatized dog. The weight of it all pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She was contemplating the mercy of a quick nap when her phone pinged with a text message. It was from Mike Dawson, the vice principal at Lily's elementary school. "Could you please call me regarding an incident with Lily today?" Sarah's heart sank. Lily had never been in trouble at school, quite the opposite. She was the quiet child teachers praised for her focus and empathy. What could possibly have happened? She dialed the school's number with shaking hands. Scenarios multiplying in her mind. Had Lily's grief resurfaced in some disruptive way? Had the stress of bringing Patch home triggered something? "Mrs. Parker, thank you for calling back so quickly." Mike's voice was professionally neutral, offering no clues. "There was a situation during morning sharing time that I wanted to discuss with you." "Is Lily okay?" Sarah asked, her exhaustion sharpening her anxiety to a razor's edge. "She's fine, just in my office at the moment." During circle time, when students were sharing weekend activities, Lily announced that you had adopted a one-eyed, fighting dog that everyone wanted to kill, but she saved him. This naturally caused some commotion among the second graders. Sarah closed her eyes, picturing the scene. "I'm so sorry, Mike. We did adopt a dog this weekend. A rescue with some special needs. Lily was very moved by the experience." "I understand that," the vice principal said carefully, "but some parents have already called expressing concern." Lily described in rather vivid detail how the dog was abused by mean men, and nobody wanted him because he looked scary. Several children became upset, and one is now afraid to walk home because, and I quote, "killer fighting dogs might escape." Sarah pressed her fingers to her temples, where a stress headache was blooming. "I'll speak with Lily about appropriate sharing topics. This is all very new, and she's..." "Sarah," Mike's voice softened slightly. "We all know Lily is a compassionate, thoughtful child, and her enthusiasm for animal welfare is admirable, but I'm concerned about how this situation might be affecting her." Mrs. Hoffman mentioned she spent all of free reading time with dog training books instead of her usual fiction, and she was overheard telling another student that it's her job to fix the broken dog because she understands what it's like to be broken. The words landed like a physical blow. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly unable to stand. "She said that?" Those were apparently her exact words. "Given Lily's history with her father's passing, I wanted to check in with you directly. How are things at home? This new responsibility, is it perhaps a bit much right now?" Sarah stared through the baby gate at Patch, still huddled in his corner, his single eye now closed as if to shut out the world entirely. Was this a mistake? Had she allowed her daughter's determination to override her own judgment as a parent? The doubt she'd been holding at bay since the auction rushed in like a tide. "We're figuring it out," she said finally. "The dog is staying in our laundry room, completely separated from Lily, except under my direct supervision. We're working with a veterinarian who specializes in behavior. It's challenging, but..." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "But Lily sees something of herself in this dog," Mike completed her thought gently. "I understand that. Just remember that you're the adult, Sarah. If this situation becomes too difficult, it's okay to reconsider. Lily's emotional well-being has to come first." After finishing the call with a promise to speak with Lily about appropriate school conversations, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, tears threatening. She was so tired, physically, emotionally, spiritually tired, in a way that sleep alone couldn't fix. The years since David's death had been a constant battle to keep herself together for Lily's sake, to create normalcy from chaos, security from loss. Now this damaged creature had entered their lives, stirring up the grief and trauma she'd worked so hard to contain. She looked at Patch again, noting how his body rested in an unnatural position, always ready for flight or defense. He couldn't relax even in sleep, his muscles twitching as if running from threats in his dreams. Sarah recognized that state too well. The hypervigilance, the inability to truly rest, the constant assessment of potential dangers. She'd lived there herself, in the months after the military officers had appeared at her door with news that had collapsed her world. "Maybe we're all a little broken," she whispered to the sleeping dog. The admission felt dangerous, a crack in the careful facade of competence she'd constructed. Yet as the words hung in the air between them, something shifted subtly in Sarah's chest. Not healing exactly, but perhaps the acknowledgement that made healing possible. The thunderstorm hit Pine Ridge without warning 3 days after Patch's arrival. Sarah was folding laundry on the couch when the first rumble shook the windows, distant but unmistakable. She glanced at the clock. Lily wouldn't be home from school for another hour, which meant Sarah faced this challenge alone. She moved quickly to the kitchen, peering through the baby gate. Patch had made marginal progress over the past few days, occasionally venturing from his corner to investigate the laundry room when he thought no one was watching. Dr. Rivera had suggested leaving small treats scattered around to encourage exploration. The strategy seemed to be working. He was gradually mapping his small territory, learning it was safe. But the approaching storm threatened to undo that fragile progress. Patch's ears were already flattened against his head, his body language shifting from cautious to panicked as another thunder roll, closer now, vibrated through the house. "It's okay," Sarah said, keeping her voice low and even, the way she'd heard Lily speak to him. "Just a storm. We're safe inside." The words sounded hollow even to her ears. What did safety mean to a creature who'd known so little of it? The platitudes she might offer a frightened child would mean nothing to Patch. The rain began suddenly, pelting against the windows with an intensity that matched the dog's rising distress. He paced the small confines of the laundry room, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. When lightning flashed, illuminating the kitchen in stark white, Patch let out a sound Sarah hadn't heard from him before. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine, but something between that raised the hair on her arms. Thunder followed immediately, a deafening crack directly overhead. The lights flickered, and Patch exploded into motion, hurling himself against the baby gate with such force that it bent outward. Sarah jumped back instinctively as the dog clawed at the barrier, his eye wild with terror. "Stop!" Sarah commanded, panic sharpening her voice. The gate wouldn't hold if he continued this assault. She grabbed a broom from the closet, not to strike, but to create distance if necessary. The unfamiliar voice and threatening posture only intensified Patch's frenzy. He backed up and charged the gate again, this time dislodging one side from its pressure mounting. In seconds, he would be loose in the house, driven by blind panic with no safe place to retreat. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't outrun him, couldn't restrain him without risking a bite, couldn't calm him with her presence the way Lily seemed able to do. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, confirming her worst fears about bringing this unpredictable animal into their home. As Patch prepared for another charge, Sarah made a split-second decision. She threw open the back door leading from the kitchen to the yard, creating an escape route. "Go!" she shouted, stepping aside. The dog hesitated for only a moment before crashing through the weakened gate and bolting past her, a blur of motion, disappearing into the rain-lashed yard. Sarah watched through the open door as Patch streaked across the grass and vanished beneath the weather-beaten shed at the property's edge. She closed the door with trembling hands, leaning against it as adrenaline drained from her system. What now? Patch was loose, terrorized, potentially dangerous in this state. If he escaped the yard, he could be hit by a car, hurt someone, or simply disappear forever. Yet approaching him in the throes of panic might only drive him to more desperate measures. Sarah dialed Dr. Rivera, explaining the situation in clipped sentences. The veterinarian's response was immediate and calm. "Don't pursue him," she instructed. "That shed is actually perfect. A small, enclosed space where he can feel protected. Block any escape routes from your yard, but don't approach the shed. Let him settle until the storm passes. I'll come over as soon as I finish with my current patient." The next hour passed with excruciating slowness. Sarah secured the rickety fence gate with rope and positioned herself at the kitchen window, watching the shed through sheets of rain. There was no sign of movement. The storm's intensity gradually diminished, transitioning from violent downpour to steady rainfall. She thought of Lily, who would arrive home soon, expecting to see the dog safely in the laundry room. How would she explain this setback to her daughter, who invested so much hope in Patch's rehabilitation? The school bus squealed to a stop at the end of the street, just as Dr. Rivera's truck pulled into the driveway. Sarah met both arrivals at the front door, Lily with her pink backpack and rain boots, the veterinarian with her medical kit, and, in calm professionalism, "Where's Patch?" were Lily's first words as she stepped into the house, shaking rain from her curls. Sarah exchanged glances with Dr. Rivera, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. "There was a situation with the storm, honey. Patch got scared and broke through the gate. He's hiding under the shed in the backyard." Lily's eyes widened with concern rather than fear. "Is he hurt?" "Thunderstorms are really scary for dogs with trauma. I read about it in my book." "We don't think he's hurt," Dr. Rivera interjected gently, crouching to Lily's eye level. "But he's very frightened right now. Your mom did exactly the right thing by giving him a safe place to hide until he calms down." The child's face set in. A determined expression Sarah recognized all too well, the same look she'd worn at the auction. "We need to let him know we're not mad at him for breaking the gate. Dogs who've been punished a lot worry that accidents mean they'll get hurt." Dr. Rivera smiled slightly. "That's absolutely right, Lily. Would you like to help us show Patch that he's still welcome here, even after what happened?" The next phase of the operation unfolded under Dr. Rivera's careful guidance. They prepared the laundry room, repairing the gate and creating what the veterinarian called a recovery space. The comforter arranged as before, with fresh water and Patch's food bowl, now containing small pieces of boiled chicken that filled the kitchen with a tempting aroma. "Now comes the waiting," Dr. Rivera explained as they sat at the kitchen table. "Forcing him to come out will only reinforce his fear. We need to make the house more appealing than the shed, then let him choose." "But how will he know?" Lily asked. Her forehead furrowed with worry. "Dogs have incredible noses," the veterinarian explained. "He can smell that chicken from the shed. He can probably hear our voices too. When his fear subsides enough, hunger and curiosity will bring him back, if he feels safe doing so." Sarah watched her daughter absorb this information, mentally adding it to her growing database of canine psychology. The child's focus on this project went beyond normal 7-year-old enthusiasm. It had the quality of mission, of purpose. Mike, Dawson's words echoed in her mind. It's her job to fix the broken dog because she understands what it's like to be broken. "Lily," Sarah said carefully, "I want you to remember what we've discussed about expectations. Patch might not come back inside today. He might not even come back tomorrow. And if he does, he might be more afraid than before because of what happened." "I know," Lily replied with unexpected maturity. "Recovery isn't a straight line. There are setbacks and hard days. That's normal." Dr. Rivera glanced at Sarah with raised eyebrows, clearly impressed by the child's insight. "That's very wise. Lily, where did you learn that?" "From my grief counselor after Dad died," the little girl answered matter-of-factly. "Miss Winters said healing is like climbing a mountain with lots of paths instead of stairs. Sometimes you have to go sideways or even back down a little to find the way up." The simple articulation of this complex truth left both adults momentarily speechless. Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest, pride in her daughter's resilience, mixed with sorrow that she'd had to develop such wisdom so young. Dr. Rivera recovered first. That's a perfect way to think about Patch's journey too. Today was a steep part of the mountain for him. Now we need to be patient while he finds his path forward. As evening approached, Dr. Rivera needed to leave for another appointment, but promised to check in the following day. The rain had stopped, though occasional distant thunder still rumbled beyond the hills. There had been no sign of movement from the shed. Lily insisted on leaving the back door slightly ajar despite the cool evening air, placing a trail of chicken pieces leading from the yard to the kitchen. Zara, too exhausted to argue, agreed with the stipulation that they would close it before bedtime, regardless of Patch's decision. After dinner, homework, and Lily's bath, Sarah tucked her daughter into bed, expecting the usual request for one more story, one more glass of water, one more minute of awake time. Instead, Lily gripped her hand with unexpected urgency. "Mom, can you tell me about Dad? The real stuff, not just the good parts." The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd always been careful to preserve David's memory as an idealized father figure, brave, kind, funny. The complicated parts of their marriage, his struggles with reintegration after previous deployments, the arguments they'd had before his final tour, these she'd kept from Lily, believing that perfect memories were a gift she could still give her daughter. "What do you mean, honey?" Sarah asked cautiously, perching on the edge of the unicorn-patterned bedspread. Lily twisted a strand of red hair around her finger, a self-soothing gesture she'd developed after David's death. "Was Dad ever scared? Like, really scared of things? The kids at school say soldiers are never afraid, but that doesn't make sense to me." Sarah considered the question, sensing its importance beyond simple curiosity. "Your dad was the bravest person I've ever known," she began slowly. "But yes, he was scared sometimes, everyone is, even of silly things." Lily pressed. A memory surfaced. David leaping onto a chair, face pale, when a mouse had scurried across their first apartment's kitchen floor. His sheepish grin afterward as he admitted that the fearless Marine could face enemy fire, but not tiny rodents. Sarah had teased him about it for years, even of silly things, she confirmed, sharing the mouse story, which made Lily giggle, and of bigger things too. "When he found out we were going to have you, he was terrified of dropping you or not knowing how to be a good father, but he was the best dad," Lily said with absolute certainty. "He was, but he didn't start out knowing how to do everything perfectly. He learned, just like we all do." Sarah paused, considering how much to share. "After his second deployment, before you were born, Dad had a hard time for a while. Loud noises bothered him. He didn't sleep well. He was jumpy." Lily's eyes widened with recognition. "Like Patch?" The parallel struck Sarah with unexpected force. "A bit like Patch, yes. The experiences in war, they stayed with him in his body and his mind. It took time for him to feel safe again. What helped him get better?" Sarah thought back to those difficult months, the therapy sessions David had initially resisted, the gradual rebuilding of trust and security, patience, routine, knowing he was loved even on the hard days, and eventually professional help from people who understood what he was going through. Lily nodded solemnly, processing this new information about her father. "Do you think Patch will come back inside?" The apparent non sequitur made perfect sense in the context of their conversation. "I hope so. But whatever he decides, we'll respect his choice and keep trying to help him feel safe." That's what Ms. Winters said about grief too, that you can't rush it, you just have to keep showing up. Lily yawned, her eyelids growing heavy. I'm going to keep showing up for Patch, like you did for Dad. Sarah swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. That's a wonderful way to think about it. She leaned down to kiss her daughter's forehead. Time for sleep now. We'll see where things stand in the morning. After turning out Lily's light, Sarah moved quietly through the house, completing her evening routine. She paused at the back door, which still stood slightly ajar as promised. The yard lay silent and silver in the moonlight that had emerged. After the storm, the shed remained dark and still. Your choice, Patch, she said softly to the night air. We'll be here either way. She was about to close the door when a slight movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness beneath the shed. Sarah held her breath, remaining absolutely motionless as the shadow resolved into Patch's hesitant form. He stood frozen at the edge of the shed's protection, one paw extended as if testing the safety of the open ground. For several minutes, neither moved. Woman and dog locked in a moment of mutual assessment. Then, with deliberate slowness, Patch lowered his head to sniff one of the chicken pieces Lily had placed in the yard. He consumed it cautiously, then looked up again, his single eye reflecting the porch light. Sarah maintained her stillness, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. The dog took another tentative step forward, then another, following the trail of food with gradual progress toward the house. Once he reached the bottom of the porch steps, Patch hesitated again, clearly conflicted between fear and hunger, between old instincts and new possibilities. Sarah could almost see the calculation happening behind that watchful eye, weighing risks, remembering traumas, assessing this new environment that had proven both threatening and surprisingly benign. The moment stretched into minutes. Sarah's legs began to cramp from her stationary position, but she didn't dare shift her weight. This was Patch's decision, his journey. She could only witness, not influence. Finally, with a deliberateness that suggested conscious choice rather than mere instinct, Patch climbed the first step, then the second. At the top of the porch, he paused again, looking directly at Sarah with an intensity that held her motionless. "It's okay," she whispered. "Whatever you decide." The dog lowered his head, sniffing at the threshold as if testing for traps. Then, with a quickness that caught Sarah by surprise, he slipped past her into the kitchen, snatched the largest piece of chicken from the floor, and retreated to the laundry room, where he pressed himself into his familiar corner with his prize. Sarah released the breath she'd been holding. She closed and locked the back door, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid startling the dog. The baby gate remained open, a calculated risk, but forcing him back into confinement after he'd chosen to return seemed counterproductive. Instead, she simply sat on the kitchen floor, her back against the refrigerator, creating a presence that was neither threatening nor demanding. Patch watched her from his corner, still trembling slightly, but noticeably less than before the storm. "Good choice," Sarah told him quietly. "Brave choice." The dog's ear twitched at her voice, but he made no other response. Still, something had shifted between them, a barely perceptible recalibration of their relationship. For the first time, Patch had made a decision based not just on fear or hunger, but on a nascent trust that this place, despite the terror of the storm, might still offer more safety than the alternatives. Sarah felt an unexpected sense of accomplishment wash over her. Not the triumphant kind that came with achieving concrete goals, but the quieter satisfaction of witnessing a small but significant step in a longer journey. "Wait until Lily sees you in the morning," she murmured, a smile touching her lips as she imagined her daughter's joy. "She never doubted you for a second." The first true breakthrough came on a crisp Saturday morning. 3 weeks after Patch's arrival, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and reviewing bills, the endless arithmetic of single parenthood that never quite balanced. Lily was cross-legged on the floor near the laundry room, reading aloud from a library book about service dogs while sketching in her notebook. The baby gate remained open, as it had since the night of the storm, an ongoing experiment in trust that seemed to be working. Patch had established a cautious routine in the intervening weeks. He would emerge from the laundry room for brief periods, especially when Lily was nearby, venturing a few feet into the kitchen before retreating to his safe corner. He still trembled when Sarah moved too quickly, or when unexpected noises disrupted the household's quiet rhythm. But the paralyzing terror of those first days had receded into a wary vigilance. Dr. Rivera's weekly visits had become less clinical and more encouraging. "He's making remarkable progress," she had noted during her last checkup, watching Patch accept a treat directly from Lily's palm. "His body language is completely different. See how his muscles aren't constantly tensed? He's beginning to believe this situation might be permanent." Now, as morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm squares on the linoleum floor, Sarah observed a subtle shift in the dog's behavior. He lay at the threshold between laundry room and kitchen, his body still oriented toward his safe space, but his head extended forward, watching Lily with focused attention. For the first time, his ear wasn't flattened against his head, but held in a neutral position, a small thing that Dr. Rivera had taught them to recognize as significant. "Look, Mom," Lily whispered, noticing the change as well. "He's relaxed his ears. That means he's not expecting anything bad to happen right now." Sarah nodded, careful not to make any sudden movements that might disrupt this peaceful moment. "You've been so patient with him, honey. It's making a difference." Sarah maintained her stillness, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. The dog took another tentative step forward, then another, following the trail of food with gradual progress toward the house. Once he reached the bottom of the porch steps, Patch hesitated again, clearly conflicted between fear and hunger, between old instincts and new possibilities. Sarah could almost see the calculation happening behind that watchful eye, weighing risks, remembering traumas, assessing this new environment that had proven both threatening and surprisingly benign. The moment stretched into minutes. Sarah's legs began to cramp from her stationary position, but she didn't dare shift her weight. This was Patch's decision, his journey. She could only witness, not influence. Finally, with a deliberateness that suggested conscious choice rather than mere instinct, Patch climbed the first step, then the second. At the top of the porch, he paused again, looking directly at Sarah with an intensity that held her motionless. "It's okay," she whispered. "Whatever you decide." The dog lowered his head, sniffing at the threshold as if testing for traps. Then, with a quickness that caught Sarah by surprise, he slipped past her into the kitchen, snatched the largest piece of chicken from the floor, and retreated to the laundry room, where he pressed himself into his familiar corner with his prize. Sarah released the breath she'd been holding. She closed and locked the back door, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid startling the dog. The baby gate remained open, a calculated risk, but forcing him back into confinement after he'd chosen to return seemed counterproductive. Instead, she simply sat on the kitchen floor, her back against the refrigerator, creating a presence that was neither threatening nor demanding. Patch watched her from his corner, still trembling slightly, but noticeably less than before the storm. "Good choice," Sarah told him quietly. "Brave choice." The dog's ear twitched at her voice, but he made no other response. Still, something had shifted between them, a barely perceptible recalibration of their relationship. For the first time, Patch had made a decision based not just on fear or hunger, but on a nascent trust that this place, despite the terror of the storm, might still offer more safety than the alternatives. Sarah felt an unexpected sense of accomplishment wash over her. Not the triumphant kind that came with achieving concrete goals, but the quieter satisfaction of witnessing a small but significant step in a longer journey. "Wait until Lily sees you in the morning," she murmured, a smile touching her lips as she imagined her daughter's joy. "She never doubted you for a second." The first true breakthrough came on a crisp Saturday morning. 3 weeks after Patch's arrival, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and reviewing bills, the endless arithmetic of single parenthood that never quite balanced. Lily was cross-legged on the floor near the laundry room, reading aloud from a library book about service dogs while sketching in her notebook. The baby gate remained open, as it had since the night of the storm, an ongoing experiment in trust that seemed to be working. Patch had established a cautious routine in the intervening weeks. He would emerge from the laundry room for brief periods, especially when Lily was nearby, venturing a few feet into the kitchen before retreating to his safe corner. He still trembled when Sarah moved too quickly, or when unexpected noises disrupted the household's quiet rhythm. But the paralyzing terror of those first days had receded into a wary vigilance. Dr. Rivera's weekly visits had become less clinical and more encouraging. "He's making remarkable progress," she had noted during her last checkup, watching Patch accept a treat directly from Lily's palm. "His body language is completely different. See how his muscles aren't constantly tensed? He's beginning to believe this situation might be permanent." Now, as morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm squares on the linoleum floor, Sarah observed a subtle shift in the dog's behavior. He lay at the threshold between laundry room and kitchen, his body still oriented toward his safe space, but his head extended forward, watching Lily with focused attention. For the first time, his ear wasn't flattened against his head, but held in a neutral position, a small thing that Dr. Rivera had taught them to recognize as significant. "Look, Mom," Lily whispered, noticing the change as well. "He's relaxed his ears. That means he's not expecting anything bad to happen right now." Sarah nodded, careful not to make any sudden movements that might disrupt this peaceful moment. "You've been so patient with him, honey. It's making a difference." As they emerged from the car, Sarah kept a firm grip on the leash, prepared for Patch to bolt if overwhelmed. Instead, after an initial moment of hesitation, he began to explore with cautious curiosity, sniffing at the gravel path and watching the ducks with perked ears. "He likes it," Lily whispered, careful not to disrupt his growing confidence. "Look how he's using his nose. Dr. Rivera said that's a good sign when dogs start exploring with their noses instead of just watching for danger." They walked slowly around the small pond, giving Patch time to investigate each new smell and sound. His body language remained alert but not fearful, his tail occasionally lifting slightly from its usual tucked position, another positive sign Dr. Rivera had taught them to recognize. Near a small wooden footbridge, they encountered an elderly man feeding the ducks. Patch immediately tensed, pressing against Lily's legs. Male strangers remained his most consistent trigger, a reaction Dr. Rivera believed was connected to past abuse. "It's okay," Lily murmured to the dog. "We can go a different way." But the man had already noticed them, his weathered face crinkling into a smile beneath a worn baseball cap. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he called out, his voice raspy but gentle. Sarah prepared to steer them in another direction, but to her surprise, Lily responded with unexpected poise. "It is nice," she agreed, positioning herself slightly in front of Patch, creating a buffer between the dog and the stranger. "We're helping our dog get used to new places. He's a bit nervous around people he doesn't know." The elderly man nodded with immediate understanding. "Ah, a rescue, is he? I can see by his eye he's had a rough go of it." He made no move to approach, instead deliberately turning his attention back to the ducks. "My Sadie was like that when I first got her, shell-shocked," from the shelter. "Took nearly a year before she'd let anyone but me pet her." "Did she get better?" Lily asked, her hand resting gently on Patch's head. The dog remained tense but hadn't tried to retreat, apparently drawing courage from the child's calm presence. "Oh, yes," ended up being the friendliest dog in the neighborhood. The man scattered more breadcrumbs for the ducks, his movements slow and predictable. The secret was letting her set the pace, never pushed her, just showed her the world was mostly good, a little bit at a time. Sarah watched as Lily absorbed this wisdom, filing it away with all the other information she'd been collecting about canine rehabilitation. What struck her most was Patch's response to this encounter. While clearly uncomfortable, he was managing his fear rather than being overwhelmed by it, watching the stranger from behind Lily's protective stance, without showing signs of aggression. After a few more minutes of casual conversation, during which the man never once tried to approach or interact directly with Patch, they continued their walk. Lily was practically vibrating with excitement. "Did you see that, Mom? He was scared, but he didn't panic, and he let me be his safe person, just like when you're scared and I hold your hand during thunderstorms." The comparison made Sarah smile, touched by her daughter's perception of their mutual caretaking. "You did beautifully, Lily. You knew exactly how to help him feel secure without making him feel trapped." They completed a full circuit of the pond without further incident. By the time they returned to the car, Patch seemed physically tired, but mentally stimulated in a way they hadn't seen before. He climbed into the back seat without hesitation, settling with a deep sigh that sounded almost like contentment. "I think that was a huge success," Sarah said as they drove home, genuinely impressed by how well the outing had gone. "Maybe we could make this a regular Saturday activity, gradually increasing the time and exposure." Lily nodded enthusiastically. "And eventually he might be able to meet some nice people, and maybe even other calm dogs." Her imagination was clearly racing ahead, envisioning a future where Patch was fully integrated into normal life. Sarah was about to offer a gentle reminder about patience and realistic expectations when she glanced in the rearview mirror and caught sight of something remarkable. Patch had fallen asleep in the back seat, his body curled in a natural position rather than the tense defensive posture he usually maintained, even in rest. His face looked different somehow, younger, more like the dog he might have been before trauma had reshaped him. The sight brought an unexpected lump to Sarah's throat. Sleep represented the ultimate vulnerability, a state of complete defenselessness. For Patch to surrender to it in a moving vehicle, away from his established safe space, suggested a level of trust they hadn't dared hope for so soon. When they arrived home, the dog woke immediately, his alertness returning. But it was a calm vigilance now, not the panicked hyper-awareness of before. He followed them into the house without hesitation, and for the first time, didn't immediately retreat to the laundry, a room. Instead, he settled in the corner of the living room, a new territory claimed in this gradual expansion of his world. That evening, as Lily worked on homework at the coffee table, Patch remained in this new spot, watching the child with steady attention. Occasionally his eye would drift to Sarah, assessing her movements as she prepared dinner, but without the extreme vigilance of earlier weeks. "Mom," Lily said suddenly, looking up from her math problems. "I think I know what Patch was meant to be." "What's that, honey?" Sarah asked, stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce. "A service dog, like in my book." Lily gestured toward Patch with her pencil. "He likes having a job. He's smart and careful, and he wanted to help me even though he's still scared of lots of things. I bet that's what he was being trained for." Before something bad happened to him, Sarah considered this theory, recalling how naturally Patch had retrieved the dropped pencil, how attentively he watched Lily's movements. "That's an interesting idea. Dr. Rivera might be able to tell from his behavior if he's had any specialized training. If he was supposed to be a service dog, then he's extra special," Lily continued, her expression earnest. "Because that means his whole purpose was helping people, and then people hurt him instead. That's even more unfair." The simple observation carried the weight of truth. Sarah looked at Patch with new eyes, wondering about his history before the auction. Had he once been a promising candidate for service work? Had his training been interrupted by abuse or neglect? The questions might never be answered, but Lily's perception added another dimension to their understanding of this complex creature they'd welcomed into their lives. "Whatever his background," Sarah said finally, "he's found the right place to heal. You've given him that, Lily." The child shook her head, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. "We all did. He needed all of us. You and me and Dr. Rivera and even Mrs. Abernathy bringing Harold's old toys. Nobody gets better all alone." As if understanding he was the subject of their conversation, Patch lifted his head, his gaze moving between mother and daughter with quiet attentiveness. For the first time since his arrival, Sarah could glimpse the dog he might become once the layers of fear were fully shed. Watchful but not fearful, cautious but not paranoid, capable of connection despite his scars. In that moment of shared understanding between the three of them, Sarah felt something shift in her own heart, a loosening of the protective shell she'd built around herself and Lily after David's death. Perhaps they had needed Patch as much as he needed them, this broken creature, teaching them that healing wasn't about erasing damage, but about finding new ways to be whole. The unwelcome visitor arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Sarah was catching up on laundry and Lily was at her weekly after-school art club. The knock came sharp and authoritative, 3 rapid strikes that sent Patch immediately into alert mode. His hackles raised as he positioned himself in the hallway between the front door and the laundry room, not retreating to his safe space as he once would have, but not approaching the door either. "Just a minute," Sarah called, hastily folding the last towel before moving to answer. She wasn't expecting anyone, and door-to-door salespeople rarely ventured down their quiet cul-de-sac. Through the peephole, she saw a broad-shouldered man in khaki uniform. Animal control was emblazoned across his breast pocket, and he held a clipboard with official-looking paperwork. Sarah's stomach tightened with immediate apprehension as she opened the door, keeping her body positioned to block. "Patch from view, Mrs. Parker?" The man's voice matched his appearance, official, slightly detached, with an underlying assertiveness that suggested he was accustomed to compliance. "Ms. Parker," she corrected automatically. "How can I help you?" "Officer Ray Dunham, County. Animal Control." He held up an ID badge briefly. "We've received a complaint about an aggressive dog on the premises, specifically a one-eyed pitbull mix obtained from the county auction last month. I need to conduct an assessment of the animal." Sarah's mind raced, trying to identify the source of this complaint. They'd been so careful with Patch, limiting his exposure to others, managing his few public outings with extreme caution. Who would report them, and for what? There must be some mistake, she said, striving to keep her voice calm. "Our dog has been kept securely on our property since adoption, and he's never shown aggression toward anyone." Officer Dunham consulted his clipboard with practiced indifference. "According to the report, the dog in question has a history of aggression, was witnessed lunging at a fence toward passers-by, and resides in a home with a minor child, creating a public safety concern." "That's simply not accurate," Sarah protested, feeling a surge of protective anger. "Who filed this complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information, ma'am. I need to see the dog and conduct my assessment. It's standard procedure." Behind her, Sarah was acutely aware of Patch's low growl, a sound she hadn't heard from him in weeks. She glanced back to see him standing rigidly in the hallway, his eye fixed not on her, but on the uniformed officer. The progress they'd made suddenly seemed terribly fragile. A male authority figure in uniform was precisely the type of trigger most likely to provoke a fear response, which could easily be misinterpreted as aggression. "Officer Dunham," Sarah said, deliberately keeping her voice steady, "our dog is a rescue who's still recovering from significant trauma. He's under veterinary supervision for behavioral rehabilitation. I'd be happy to show you his records and Dr. Rivera's documentation of his progress, but having a stranger in uniform enter the house right now would be extremely distressing for him." The animal control officer's expression remained unmoved. "Ms. Parker, I understand your concern, but I have a job to do. If the dog is as well behaved as you claim, this should be a quick routine visit. If he's not, then we have a legitimate safety issue to address." Sarah felt trapped between impossible options. Refusing the inspection would only validate the complaint in the officer's mind, potentially leading to more severe consequences. Yet allowing him inside now, with Patch already showing signs of distress, seemed like a recipe for disaster that could undo weeks of careful rehabilitation. "May I make a call first?" she asked, playing for time. "Our veterinary behaviorist would want to be present for any official assessment. She can be here within 30 minutes. Officer Dunham checked his watch with obvious impatience. "I have other calls to make today, Miss Parker. If you're refusing inspection—" "I'm not refusing," Sarah interrupted. I'm requesting appropriate accommodations for a special needs animal under professional care. Surely that's reasonable. Something in her tone, perhaps the nurse's authority she'd developed from years of advocating for vulnerable patients, seemed to give the officer pause. He studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. 30 minutes. I'll wait in my vehicle. If your veterinarian hasn't arrived by then, we proceed regardless. As the officer returned to his truck parked at the curb, Sarah quickly closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Patch had retreated several steps down the hallway, but remained visible, his body tense with vigilance. "It's okay," she told him softly. "Good job staying calm." Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed Dr. Rivera's number, praying the veterinarian wasn't in surgery or otherwise unavailable. To her immense relief, Eleanor answered on the third ring. "It's an emergency," Sarah explained, keeping her voice low and even for Patch's benefit despite her rising panic. "Animal control is here about a complaint. They're insisting on assessing." Patch immediately. There was a brief silence on the other end as Dr. Rivera processed this information. "I'm finishing with a patient now. I can be there in 20 minutes. In the meantime, move Patch to the most neutral, quiet space in your house, somewhere he feels safe but not cornered. Have his training records and medical file ready. And Sarah, stay calm. Dogs read our emotional state instantly." After ending the call, Sarah took a deep breath and forced herself to follow the veterinarian's instructions methodically. She gathered Patch's file from her desk drawer, including Dr. Rivera's detailed behavior assessments and training plans. Then she gently encouraged Patch to follow her to Lily's bedroom, a space he'd recently started visiting voluntarily, apparently drawn by her familiar scent. "Good boy," she murmured as he settled on the small rug beside Lily's bed. "We just need to stay calm until Dr. Rivera gets here. Everything's going to be fine." But her mind was racing with questions and fears. Who would have filed a complaint? The only person who'd expressed any concern was Mrs. Abernathy, and Sarah couldn't imagine her kindly neighbor taking such a drastic step without speaking to her first. Had someone misinterpreted Patch's behavior during one of their cautious outings? Had a passerby seen him in the yard and been frightened by his appearance alone? More worryingly, what would happen if Patch reacted fearfully during the assessment? Animal control had the authority to remove dogs deemed dangerous, and pit bulls already faced heightened scrutiny and breed-specific prejudice. After everything they'd been through, the thought of Patch being taken away, possibly even euthanized, was unbearable. Dr. Rivera arrived in 17 minutes, her expression calm but determined as Sarah let her in. She carried her medical bag and a folder of what appeared to be additional documentation. "Officer Dunham is still in his truck," Sarah reported in a low voice. "Patch is in Lily's room. He was growling when the officer first knocked, but he's calmer now." "That's good," Dr. Rivera nodded. "Let me speak with the officer first, establish the parameters for assessment. It would be best if we could conduct this in the backyard, neutral territory that doesn't feel like an invasion of Patch's home space." Sarah watched through the window as Dr. Rivera approached the animal control truck. The conversation appeared, civil but intense, with the veterinarian doing most of the talking, occasionally pointing to her documentation. After several minutes, Officer Dunham emerged from his vehicle, his body language suggesting reluctant concession. "We've reached a compromise," Dr. Rivera explained upon returning. "I'll bring Patch to the backyard. The officer will observe from a distance initially, then gradually decrease proximity based on Patch's comfort level. I've convinced him that a proper behavioral assessment can't be conducted under conditions of maximum stress. The plan made sense, but Sarah still felt a knot of anxiety. What if Patch reacts badly? He's made so much progress, but strange men in uniform are still his biggest trigger. I've made that clear to Officer Dunham, and to his credit he's agreed to take that into account. I've also brought documentation of similar cases I've worked with showing the rehabilitation trajectory of formerly fearful dogs. Dr. Rivera's expression softened. Sarah, this is unavoidable now that a formal complaint has been filed. Our best strategy is to demonstrate Patch's progress transparently while advocating for appropriate accommodations. The next hour unfolded with the careful choreography of a medical procedure. Dr. Rivera first brought Patch to the backyard on his leash, allowing him to acclimate to the space, while Officer Dunham observed silently from the far side of the fence. The dog's initial tension was evident, but he remained responsive to the veterinarian's quiet commands, sitting when asked and maintaining his composure despite his obvious awareness of the stranger's presence. Gradually, following Dr. Rivera's lead, Officer Dunham entered the yard and seated himself on a garden chair at a respectful distance. He avoided direct eye contact with Patch, a technique the veterinarian had obviously instructed him on. Sarah remained near the back door, watching with a mixture of pride and apprehension as Dr. Rivera led Patch through a series of basic obedience exercises, demonstrating his ability to focus despite distraction. As you can see, the veterinarian explained professionally, Patch exhibits appropriate caution but no aggression. His body language shows alertness, but not the frozen posture or whale eye that would indicate imminent defensive reaction. She pointed out specific details, the position of his ears, the absence of raised hackles, the relaxed jaw, that indicated non-aggressive vigilance rather than threat assessment. Officer Dunham made notes on his clipboard, his expression unreadable. The complaint specifically mentioned lunging at the fence and growling at passers-by, he noted. Dr. Rivera nodded. That's not uncommon in dogs recovering from trauma. Barrier frustration can look like aggression to untrained observers, particularly in certain breeds that are already subject to stereotyping. The critical question isn't whether Patch has ever displayed fearful behavior, but whether he's being responsibly managed and showing improvement through appropriate rehabilitation. The assessment continued with structured tests of Patch's reactions to various stimuli, a sudden movement, a dropped object, a recorded doorbell sound. Each time, his response was measured and appropriate, alert but not panicked, watchful, but not aggressive. I'd like to see his reaction to direct handling, Officer Dunham said finally, setting aside his clipboard. Dr. Rivera hesitated. That would be pushing his current comfort level significantly. He's still building trust with unfamiliar males. Would you accept my demonstration instead? The officer shook his head. The complaint concerns public safety. I need to gauge his reaction to a stranger's handling to make a proper assessment. Sarah tensed, seeing months of progress potentially unraveling in a single forced interaction. But before she could intervene, Dr. Rivera made a surprising suggestion. What if we compromise? Instead of handling, approach indirectly with a food reward. That would demonstrate his ability to accept positive interaction from a male stranger, without pushing him beyond his rehabilitation threshold. After a moment's consideration, Officer Dunham agreed. Following Dr. Rivera's specific instructions, He crouched down, avoiding direct eye contact, and extended his hand with a treat resting on his open palm. Patch watched this development with obvious wariness, his body language stiffening. The moment stretched painfully as the dog assessed this new challenge. Sarah held her breath, acutely aware that everything might depend on this single interaction. Patch looked at Dr. Rivera, then at Sarah by the door, as if seeking confirmation that this stranger could be trusted. The silence in the yard felt weighted with consequence. Then, with deliberate caution, Patch took 3 steps forward. He stretched his neck to sniff Officer Dunham's outstretched hand, maintaining a careful distance with his body while investigating the offered treat. After a tense moment of assessment, he delicately took the treat, retreated several paces, and consumed it while keeping his eye on the officer. "That," Dr. Rivera said quietly, "is remarkable progress for a dog with his history. 6 weeks ago, he couldn't tolerate being in the same room with a male stranger. What you just witnessed demonstrates not aggression, but appropriate caution and growing confidence." Officer Dunham stood slowly, retrieving his clipboard. "The behavior I just observed doesn't match the complaint description," he acknowledged. "Based on this assessment, I don't see evidence of a public safety threat, provided current management protocols remain in place." Relief flooded through Sarah as the officer completed his paperwork, indicating that no further action would be taken regarding the complaint. As he prepared to leave, however, a question nagged at her. "Officer Dunham, I understand you can't identify who filed the complaint, but can you tell me when it was made? We're trying to understand what might have triggered this concern so we can address it." The animal control officer hesitated, then apparently decided this much information wouldn't violate protocol. "The report was filed yesterday morning by phone. The caller identified himself as a concerned neighbor who'd witnessed the dog's behavior on multiple occasions." Sarah frowned. "That's strange. Patch is never outside unattended, and we've been extremely careful about his limited public interactions." Officer Dunham shrugged, clearly considering the matter closed. "False or exaggerated reports happen occasionally, especially with certain breeds that attract more scrutiny. Just maintain your current precautions. Continue working with Dr. Rivera, and you shouldn't have further issues with our department." After the officer departed, Sarah collapsed onto a kitchen chair, the tension of the past hour finally catching up with her. Patch approached cautiously, placing his head on her knee in a gesture that still surprised her with its gentleness. "He did beautifully," Dr. Rivera observed, joining them. "Far better than I would have predicted a few weeks ago. The progress he's making is exceptional, Sarah." "But who would file a false complaint?" Sarah wondered aloud, absently stroking Patch's head. "And why? We've been so careful." The veterinarian's expression grew thoughtful. "The timing is interesting. Right after you've started taking him out. In public, once he began showing visible signs of recovery." She hesitated. "Have you had any unusual encounters recently? Anyone showing particular interest in Patch?" Sarah thought back over their limited outings. The duck pond, a quiet walk around the neighborhood, a brief visit to the veterinary clinic for Patch's vaccines. Nothing unusual stood out except, "There was one thing," she said slowly. "Last week at the school pickup line, a man I didn't recognize commented on Patch waiting in the car. He asked several questions about where we got him, seemed particularly interested in his eye. I assumed he was just another parent." Dr. Rivera's frown deepened. "Did he give a name or any information about himself?" No, just made conversation while we waited for the children. He mentioned having dogs himself. Sarah paused, a new worry forming. Do you think it could be connected? I don't know, the veterinarian admitted. But in my experience, legitimate concerns about animal behavior come from people who identify themselves openly. Anonymous complaints sometimes have other motivations. The implication hung in the air between them, too nebulous to articulate fully, but troubling nonetheless. Patch seemed to sense the shift in mood, pressing closer to Sarah's leg. What do we do now? She asked. Nothing different, Dr. Rivera said firmly. You continue Patch's rehabilitation exactly as planned. This assessment actually demonstrates how far he's come. He handled a highly stressful situation with appropriate caution but no aggression. That's remarkable given his history. Sarah nodded, but the encounter had left her uneasy. For the first time since bringing Patch home, she felt not just the challenge of rehabilitating a traumatized dog, but a vague sense of external threat, as if their fragile progress had attracted unwelcome attention from someone with unknown intentions. When does Lily get home? Dr. Rivera asked, breaking into her troubled thoughts. Mrs. Abernathy is bringing her back from art club in about 20 minutes. Good. I'd like to talk with her too. Her bond with Patch is extraordinary, and she should understand what happened today in age-appropriate terms. Children often sense when adults are worried, even when we try to hide it. The suggestion made sense. Lily's intuitive understanding of Patch had been their greatest asset in his rehabilitation. If there was indeed something concerning about the complaint and the mysterious stranger, her observant nature might prove valuable. As Dr. Rivera prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Sarah, you've created something remarkable here. A safe space for healing, not just for Patch, but for all of you. Don't let this incident undermine your confidence. Whatever motivated that complaint, the facts speak for themselves. Patch isn't a danger. He's a survivor finding his way back to trust. The words offered some comfort, but as Sarah watched the veterinarian drive away, the sense of unease remained. She looked down at Patch, who had settled at her feet with uncharacteristic closeness, as if offering solidarity in the aftermath of their shared ordeal. Someone's interested in you, she told him quietly. The question is, why? The mystery deepened the following week when Sarah received a call from Officer Jenkins, the animal control officer who had been present at the auction. His voice sounded tense, almost apologetic as he explained the reason for his contact. Ms. Parker, I'm calling about the dog you adopted, the one-eyed pitbull mix from last month's county auction. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. Patch, yes, we just had a visit from Officer Dunham about a complaint that turned out to be unfounded. That's partially why I'm calling, Jenkins said. Something unusual has come up. I've had 2 separate inquiries about that specific dog in the past week. People asking for details about the adoption, who took him, contact information. It's not standard procedure to share that information, so I refused. But I thought you should know. A chill ran through Sarah as she processed this news. Who was asking? The first was a man claiming to be the dog's previous owner, saying there had been a mistake and he wanted him back. Had no documentation to support this, of course, and the dog was legally surrendered when found abandoned on the Johnson property. And the second inquiry, Jenkins hesitated. Someone representing a research facility said they had a particular interest in dogs with the behavioral profile matching your adoption. wouldn't specify further when I pressed for details. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her eyes automatically seeking out Patch, who was napping on his new bed in the living room corner, a spot that offered both comfort and a clear view of the house's main entrances. In sleep, his face looked younger, the scarred tissue around his missing eye less prominent. "What kind of research facility?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "They didn't specify, just flash some credentials I wasn't familiar with. The whole thing felt off, which is why I'm calling you directly instead of going through channels. Technically, I shouldn't be sharing this at all. There was one thing," she said slowly. "Last week at the school pickup line, a man I didn't recognize commented on Patch waiting in the car. He asked several questions about where we got him. Seemed particularly interested in his eye. I assumed he was just another parent." Dr. Rivera's frown deepened. "Did he give a name or any information about himself?" "No, just made conversation while we waited for the children. He mentioned having dogs himself." Sarah paused, a new worry forming. "Do you think it could be connected?" "I don't know," the veterinarian admitted. "But in my experience, legitimate concerns about animal behavior come from people who identify themselves openly. Anonymous complaints sometimes have other motivations." The implication hung in the air between them, too nebulous to articulate fully, but troubling nonetheless. Patch seemed to sense the shift in mood, pressing closer to Sarah's leg. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Nothing different," Dr. Rivera said firmly. "You continue Patch's rehabilitation exactly as planned. This assessment actually demonstrates how far he's come. He handled a highly stressful situation with appropriate caution, but no aggression. That's remarkable given his history." Sarah nodded, but the encounter had left her uneasy. For the first time since bringing Patch home, she felt not just the challenge of rehabilitating a traumatized dog, but a vague sense of external threat, as if their fragile progress had attracted unwelcome attention from someone with unknown intentions. "When does Lily get home?" Dr. Rivera asked, breaking into her troubled thoughts. "Mrs. Abernathy is bringing her back from art club in about 20 minutes. Good, I'd like to talk with her too. Her bond with Patch is extraordinary, and she should understand what happened today in age-appropriate terms. Children often sense when adults are worried, even when we try to hide it." The suggestion made sense. Lily's intuitive understanding of Patch had been their greatest asset in his rehabilitation. If there was indeed something concerning about the complaint and the mysterious stranger, her observant nature might prove valuable. As Dr. Rivera prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Sarah, you've created something remarkable here, a safe space for healing, not just for Patch, but for all of you. Don't let this incident undermine your confidence. Whatever motivated that complaint, the facts speak for themselves. Patch isn't a danger. He's a survivor finding his way back to trust." The words offered some comfort, but as Sarah watched the veterinarian drive away, the sense of unease remained. She looked down at Patch, who had settled at her feet with uncharacteristic closeness, as if offering solidarity in the aftermath of their shared ordeal. "Someone's interested in you," she told him quietly. "The question is, why?" The mystery deepened the following week, when Sarah received a call from Officer Jenkins, the animal control officer who had been present at the auction. His voice sounded tense, almost apologetic, as he explained the reason for his contact. "Ms. Parker, I'm calling about the dog you adopted, the one-eyed pitbull mix from last month's county auction." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. Patch. Yes, we just had a visit from Officer Dunham about a complaint that turned out to be unfounded. That's partially why I'm calling, Jenkins said. Something unusual has come up. I've had 2 separate inquiries about that specific dog in the past week. People asking for details about the adoption, who took him, contact information. It's not standard procedure to share that information, so I refused. But I thought you should know. A chill ran through Sarah as she processed this news. Who was asking? The first was a man claiming to be the dog's previous owner, saying there had been a mistake and he wanted him back. Had no documentation to support this, of course, and the dog was legally surrendered when found abandoned on the Johnson property. And the second inquiry, Jenkins hesitated. Someone representing a research facility said they had a particular interest in dogs with the behavioral profile matching your adoption. Wouldn't specify further when I pressed for details. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her eyes automatically seeking out Patch, who was napping on his new bed in the living room corner. A spot that offered both comfort and a clear view of the house's main entrances. In sleep, his face looked younger, the scarred tissue around his missing eye less prominent. What kind of research facility? She asked, keeping her voice low. They didn't specify, just flashed some credentials I wasn't familiar with. The whole thing felt off, which is why I'm calling you directly instead of going through channels. Technically, I shouldn't be sharing this at all. I appreciate it, Sarah said sincerely. We've grown quite attached to Patch, and he's making remarkable progress. Dr. Rivera, our veterinary behaviorist, says his recovery is exceptional. That's good to hear, Jenkins replied, genuine warmth entering his voice. Your daughter was so determined that day, made quite an impression on all of us. After thanking the officer for his warning, Sarah sat motionless at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of these developments. Who would suddenly be so interested in a one-eyed rescue pit bull with a history of abuse? The question nagged at her as she prepared dinner, checked Lily's homework, and moved through their evening routine. She decided not to share this newest concern with Lily just yet. Her daughter was finally sleeping through the night consistently, the nightmares about her father's death having decreased significantly since Patch's arrival. The dog had become Lily's project, her purpose, her proof that broken things could be mended. Sarah wouldn't introduce new anxieties unless absolutely necessary. Instead, she called Dr. Rivera after Lily went to bed, relaying Officer Jenkins' information as Patch lay at her feet, apparently listening to the conversation with characteristic attentiveness. A research facility, the veterinarian repeated, her professional composure wavering slightly. That's unusual. What kind of research would involve traumatized dogs? Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her all evening. There are legitimate behavioral studies, of course. Universities researching trauma responses, rehabilitation techniques, that sort of thing. But those programs typically work through established channels, with full transparency and ethical oversight. Dr. Rivera's tone conveyed her skepticism. Did Officer Jenkins mention any specific organization? No, just that their credentials seemed questionable. A thoughtful silence followed. Sarah, I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, but there have been cases of dogs with certain histories being targeted for less reputable research, particularly those with established fear or aggressive responses that can be exploited or manipulated. The implication turned Sarah's blood cold. You mean like training fighting dogs? But Patch isn't aggressive. He's fearful, and we're working through that successfully. Fighting dogs would be the crudest application, Dr. Rivera said carefully. There are other possibilities: security training that exploits fear responses, pharmaceutical testing, even psychological research that wouldn't pass ethical review boards through standard channels. Sarah looked down at Patch, who had raised his head at her obvious distress, his single eye regarding her with concern. The bond between them had grown so gradually she hardly noticed its development, but it was undeniably there, a tentative trust that had begun to flourish in both directions. After thanking the officer for his warning, Sarah sat motionless at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of these developments. Who would suddenly be so interested in a one-eyed rescue pit bull with a history of abuse? The question nagged at her as she prepared dinner, checked Lily's homework, and moved through their evening routine. She decided not to share this newest concern with Lily just yet. Her daughter was finally sleeping through the night consistently, the nightmares about her father's death having decreased significantly since Patch's arrival. The dog had become Lily's project, her purpose, her proof that broken things could be mended. Sarah wouldn't introduce new anxieties unless absolutely necessary. Instead, she called Dr. Rivera after Lily went to bed, relaying Officer Jenkins' information as Patch lay at her feet, apparently listening to the conversation with characteristic attentiveness. "A research facility," the veterinarian repeated, her professional composure wavering slightly. "That's unusual." "What kind of research would involve traumatized dogs?" Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her all evening. "There are legitimate behavioral studies, of course. Universities researching trauma responses, rehabilitation techniques, that sort of thing. But those programs typically work through established channels, with full transparency and ethical oversight." Dr. Rivera's tone conveyed her skepticism. "Did Officer Jenkins mention any specific organization?" "No, just that their credentials seemed questionable." A thoughtful silence followed. "Sarah, I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, but there have been cases of dogs with certain histories being targeted for less reputable research, particularly those with established fear or aggressive responses that can be exploited or manipulated." The implication turned Sarah's blood cold. "You mean like training fighting dogs? But Patch isn't aggressive. He's fearful, and we're working through that successfully." "Fighting dogs would be the crudest application," Dr. Rivera said carefully. "There are other possibilities: security training that exploits fear responses, pharmaceutical testing, even psychological research that wouldn't pass ethical review boards through standard channels." Sarah looked down at Patch, who had raised his head at her obvious distress, his single eye regarding her with concern. The bond between them had grown so gradually she hardly noticed its development, but it was undeniably there, a tentative trust that had begun to flourish in both directions. "What should we do?" she asked finally. "For now, heightened awareness, no unattended time outdoors, careful monitoring of your surroundings during walks or outings. I'd also suggest documenting Patch's progress more systematically. Photos, videos, behavior logs. If there's ever a dispute about his rightful custody, such documentation could prove crucial." The conversation ended with Dr. Rivera promising to discreetly inquire among her professional contacts about any unusual research initiatives involving former shelter dogs, particularly those with trauma histories. It wasn't much of an action plan, but it was something. Sarah slept poorly that night, waking to every small sound, her mind constructing scenarios each more troubling than the last. Who was the man claiming to be Patch's owner? What kind of research would target a dog like him? The questions circled endlessly, leaving her exhausted as morning dawned. After seeing Lily off to school, Sarah decided to channel her anxiety into productive action. Following Dr. Rivera's advice, she began creating a detailed record of Patch's rehabilitation. She filmed his morning routine, how he now approached her for his breakfast without hesitation, how he brought his leash when he needed to go outside, how he responded appropriately to basic commands despite never having formal training. As she worked, Sarah realized how profoundly Patch had changed in the relatively short time since the auction. The constantly trembling, cowering creature had been replaced by a still cautious but increasingly confident dog who showed genuine attachment to both her and Lily. His body language had transformed, ears often perked rather than flattened, tail occasionally wagging during play sessions with Lily, eye bright and engaged rather than dull with fear. "You're a completely different dog," she told him as he followed her through the house, his new shadow-like behavior a recent development. "No wonder someone's interested in your progress." But that was precisely what troubled her. Why would anyone care about this specific dog's rehabilitation? Thousands of traumatized animals moved through the shelter system annually, many finding homes where they gradually recovered. What made Patch different? The question lingered as she prepared for her afternoon shift at the hospital. Mrs. Abernathy would collect Lily from school and stay with her until Sarah returned that evening, their standard arrangement that had evolved to include careful management of Patch's interactions. The elderly woman had gradually overcome her initial wariness of the dog, won over by his gentle demeanor around Lily and his obvious efforts to overcome his fears. "We'll be fine," Mrs. Abernathy assured her when she arrived, her silver hair freshly permed for her weekly bridge club. "Harold's old collection of tennis balls turned out to be quite a hit yesterday. Your Patch has quite the gentle mouth for retrieving, brings them back without a single tooth mark." Retrieving skills were another recent discovery. Patch's surprising enthusiasm for fetching games had emerged during play sessions with Lily. He approached the activity with an almost professional focus, bringing items back and placing them precisely at their feet, then waiting attentively for the next throw. It was yet another hint of his possible background. Such natural retrieving talent suggested some form of previous training. Sarah was explaining the new security precautions to Mrs. Abernathy. Keep doors locked, no visitors. Patch to remain indoors, except for brief bathroom breaks under direct supervision, when her phone buzzed with a text from Lily's school. "Your daughter is being picked up early by her uncle. Please confirm authorization." Sarah stared at the message in confusion. Lily had no uncle. David had been an only child, and Sarah's brother lived in Australia. Heart suddenly pounding, she immediately called the school office. "This is Sarah Parker. I just received a text about Lily being picked up by an uncle." "That's not possible. She doesn't have an uncle in the country." The school secretary's voice shifted from professional to concerned. "Oh dear. A man just arrived claiming to be your brother-in-law, said there was a family emergency. He had ID matching your last name. We were just following protocol by texting for confirmation." "Where is Lily now?" Sarah demanded, already grabbing her. "Car keys, still in class. The man is waiting in the office. Should I call security?" "Yes, immediately. I'm on my way. Do not release my daughter to anyone but me." Sarah's hands shook as she ended the call and dialed 911, briefly explaining the situation as she rushed to her car. Mrs. Abernathy followed, her earlier composure replaced by genuine alarm. "I'll stay with Patch," the older woman insisted. "You go, and Sarah, be careful. This doesn't sound right at all." The 10-minute drive to Pine Ridge Elementary passed in a blur of fear and confusion. Who would attempt to remove Lily from school under false pretenses? The most obvious answer, a custody dispute, made no sense given David's death and her lack of contentious relationships. The timing, however, coming so soon after the mysterious inquiries about Patch, seemed too coincidental to ignore. By the time Sarah arrived, a police cruiser was already in the school parking lot. The officer, a young woman with a serious expression, met her at the entrance. The man left when the secretary stalled the pickup process, she explained, walking Sarah to the office. "We have a description and security footage. Principal Dawson has your daughter waiting in his office. She's fine, just a bit confused about what's happening." Relief weakened Sarah's knees when she saw Lily sitting in Mike Dawson's office, contentedly drawing on a notepad, completely unaware of the potential danger that had been averted. "Mommy!" Lily looked up in surprise. "Why are you here? School's not over yet." "There was a mix-up, honey," Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice steady as she hugged her daughter tightly. "We're going to go home a little early today. Mike..." Dawson's expression was grave as he handed Sarah a visitor badge the man had been issued. "This is concerning, Sarah." The individual presented what appeared to be legitimate identification, identifying him as David Parker's brother. He was quite convincing. New details about Lily, mentioned her teacher by name, even referenced her recent art project. The police officer, who had introduced herself as Officer Chen, nodded in agreement. This suggests a level of surveillance or information gathering. Has anything unusual happened recently that might explain this interest? "In your family?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to share with Lily present. "Can we step outside for a moment?" "Lily, sweetheart, can you keep drawing for just a minute while I talk to Officer Chen and Mr. Dawson?" Once in the hallway, Sarah quickly outlined the recent events. The mysterious complaint to Animal Control, Officer Jenkins' call about inquiries regarding Patch, and now this attempted removal of Lily from school. "You think these incidents are connected to the dog?" Officer Chen asked skeptically. "It sounds implausible, I know, but the timing is too coincidental. Something about Patch has attracted attention we don't understand." Mike Dawson frowned. "The rescue dog Lily mentioned during sharing time, the one with one eye?" "Yes, we've had him for just over 6 weeks now. He's made remarkable progress in rehabilitation, but there's been unusual interest in him from multiple sources." Officer Chen made notes on her pad. "I'll need a full description of the dog, any identifying marks, where you obtained him, all recent incidents you consider suspicious. We'll review the security footage and circulate the man's image to patrol units." The seriousness with which the officer treated her concerns provided some reassurance, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing a crucial piece of information. The connection that would explain why a traumatized one-eyed pitbull and her 7-year-old daughter had become targets of such focused interest. As they prepared to leave, Mike Dawson placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We'll enhance security protocols immediately. No student released without direct visual confirmation from authorized guardians. Additional monitoring of school grounds during arrivals and dismissals. And Sarah, consider keeping Lily home for a few days until this situation is clarified." The Sechais, Suggestion made sense, but it also underscored the reality of their situation. Whatever was happening had already disrupted the careful normalcy she'd worked so hard to establish since David's death. The safe, predictable environment she'd created for Lily was once again under threat, this time from an unknown source with unclear intentions. Officer Chen accompanied them home, following in her patrol car and conducting a thorough check of the property before leaving. "I'll increase patrols in your neighborhood for the next few days," she promised, "and I've submitted the security footage for analysis. We should be able to identify the individual who attempted to pick up your daughter." After the officer left, Sarah found Mrs. Abernathy and Patch waiting anxiously in the living room. The dog immediately approached Lily, pressing against her legs in an uncharacteristic display of physical affection. The little girl knelt to hug him, burying her face in his fur. "He knew something was wrong," Mrs. Abernathy said quietly. "Started pacing and whining about 20 minutes after you left. I've never seen him so agitated." Sarah watched the interaction between child and dog with new awareness. Whatever bond had formed between them transcended simple companionship. There was a mutual protectiveness, an intuitive understanding that seemed to deepen with each challenge. Patch had sensed the threat to Lily even from miles away, just as Lily had sensed his capacity for recovery when everyone else saw only a damaged animal. As Mrs. Abernathy prepared to leave, she pulled Sarah aside. "Whatever's happening here, don't face it alone. This community cares about you and Lily." She hesitated, then added, "And that dog, there's more to him than meets the eye. The way he watches over Lily reminds me of how my Harold used to check on the grandchildren at night, making rounds like he was still on police duty." The comparison struck Sarah with unexpected force. Harold had been a retired police K9 before becoming Mrs. Abernathy's beloved companion in his later years. Could Patch have a similar background? Not just any training, but specialized work? The possibility opened new avenues of consideration as Sarah secured the house for the evening, double-checking locks and windows, while Lily, seemingly unaffected by the day's events, played a gentle game of tug with Patch in the living room. Something about this dog had made him valuable enough for someone to go to extraordinary lengths to locate him, filing false complaints, making inquiries through official channels, even attempting to use Lily as leverage. The question was no longer just who was interested in Patch, but what they knew about him that Sarah did not. As she watched Lily and Patch together, their mutual trust, now a stark contrast to their first uncertain days, Sarah made a silent promise to both of them. Whatever secrets Patch's past might hold, whatever danger now shadowed their family, she would protect what they had built together. This hard-won peace, this emerging healing for all three of them, was worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed, investigations revealed Patch was a specialized search and rescue dog, believed lost during a mission. His former handler, Marcus Reed, was located through legitimate channels and visited properly, bringing documentation and sharing tears of joy at finding his partner alive. Rather than separation, they formed a unique arrangement. Marcus trained Sarah and Lily in handling techniques while starting a community program for trauma survivors, human and canine alike. Patch, once broken, became the bridge between two families healing together, proving that sometimes what's lost returns stronger, bringing unexpected gifts to those brave enough to love without reservation. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of rescue and redemption. Leave a like if Patch's journey touched your heart, and share your own stories of healing in the comments below.